So this has been months in the making. I've scoured commentary tracks, articles, interviews, Reddit threads. I've rewatched this movie so many times, and I've compiled everything that I found interesting, and we're going to cover it here. Released in 1995, Se7en is the second feature-length film by the legendary David Fincher. Written by Andrew Kevin Walker, Se7en tells the story of detectives William Somerset and David Mills as they track down a serial killer who uses the 7 deadly sins as his modus operandi. And this movie has aged impeccably well. Today it lives in the pantheon of greatest thrillers of all time. It's up there with Silence of the Lambs and Chinatown and Vertigo. It's been at number 20 on the IMDb top 250 movies of all time for so many years, and even Letterboxd loves this movie. But the thing is that Se7en is such an unlikely success. On paper, none of this should have happened. It was written by a guy from a small town in Pennsylvania who worked at a record store. It was directed by a guy who swore he would never direct another movie again after the disappointment of his first film. And then it was funded by, at the time, a small studio in New Line Cinema who took a big gamble putting $30 million behind an R-rated psychological horror movie about a serial killer. I mean, this is not a quadrant movie. And yet, when Se7en dropped in 1995, it was a phenomenon. And that's my bedtime. That year, Se7en grossed the same amount of money as Batman. It grossed the same amount of money as Pocahontas, the same amount of money as James Bond. There is not much separating the box office of Se7en and the box office of Toy Story. Like, can you imagine that happening today? And we're gonna dive in and try to understand how all of this came to be. Now, in terms of the whiteboard situation, at the top we have a timeline of David Fincher's career. Down the bottom we have a timeline for Se7en itself. And then in the middle, just a lot of stuff. And so with that, let's go back to the very beginning, 1962. So David Fincher was born on August 28th, 1962 in Denver, Colorado. His mother, Claire, worked as a mental health nurse, and his father, Howard Kelly Jack Fincher, was a writer. And he did a plethora of things in the world of journalism, but he eventually became the bureau chief of Life magazine, which, you know, is kind of a big deal. And then in the 1990s, Fincher's dad decided to challenge himself by writing a screenplay, which he had never done before. And this would actually end up becoming Mank, which many years later, David Fincher would go on to direct. And that is the extent of my Mank video lore explained. At age 2, Fincher's family packs up camp and they move to San Anselmo, California, which is just 20 miles north of San Francisco, a city which we see play a big part in Fincher's career later on. I've just noticed I made a typo on that, so don't pay any attention to it. And Fincher's described this area as being a place where filmmaking was in the air, you know, it was prevalent. 70s San Francisco was kind of popping off movie-wise. You've got The Godfather, The Conversation, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I mean, the greatest movie of all time literally came out of San Francisco. And of course, I'm talking about Tommy Wiseau's 2003 movie, The Room, but I digress. Fincher said, quote, "Everyone on my block wanted to be a director." And funny enough, there was a young guy who lived on the same street as Fincher who was also really into movies. And his name was George Lucas. And he'll tie back into the story a little bit later. So David Fincher is 8 years old when everything changes. His father takes him along to the movies to see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And after the movie is over, they head back to the car and Fincher's dad is like, "So what did you think?" And Fincher is like, "I want to make movies now. This will be my thing." And so his parents buy him a Super 8 camera, and Fincher starts making his own little home movies. And I couldn't find any of these movies. I'm sure they're locked away in like a vault somewhere, but in my head, I'm picturing Fabelmans, but with Fincher. When Fincher is a teenager, he moves to Ashland, Oregon, and it's during this time while he's attending high school that he starts immersing himself in the craft of storytelling. So Fincher gets involved with these school productions. He starts out working on the lighting for plays, but eventually he ends up directing the school plays. And then after school, anytime from 6 o'clock, sometimes to 1 in the morning, he worked as a projectionist at the Varsity Theater. And so while he's there, he's watching the same movies over and over and over again, and he's absorbing them and studying them, and this is kind of like film school for him. It's similar to what we talked about in the Tarantino video. Fincher said, quote, I saw all that jazz 200 times. I saw 1941 200 times. So it was whatever was there that was interesting, I just would watch it. And after high school, Fincher attends this summer school film program. And it's through this program that Fincher actually ends up getting a job working in the darkroom for filmmaker John Korty. And the thing with John Korty is that he's kind of connected with other filmmakers who played a role in what would become known as the New Hollywood movement. And this is because Korty's studio was located in the same building as the production company American Zoetrope, which was founded by none other than Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas. And American Zoetrope are responsible for like an extraordinary number of classics. We're talking stuff by Kurosawa, Wim Wenders, Paul Schrader, and basically anyone who ever made a movie with the last name Coppola. And there's a lot of them. So this is the world that Fincher finds himself cast into straight out of high school. He's working in the darkroom in this building surrounded by all-time filmmakers. And it's that thing that you always hear people say about Fincher, that he's a technician, he's a very technical filmmaker, and that's well earned because the technical aspects are what he's going to spend this early part of his career working on. So after half a year in the darkroom, Fincher moves into the animation department, and he described this experience as, quote, mostly just moving boxes and being a PA. So Fincher's first break is a moment of serendipity. Fincher's helping work on this VFX sequence in a movie, I believe it's called Twice Upon a Time, but basically there's this sequence where these characters were going to be flying through live action traffic. And Fincher cooks up this idea that to achieve this effect, you could take a Steadicam, gyro stabilize it, shoot the flying plate at 4 frames a second, and then when you play everything back at 24 frames a second, it looks sped up and really slick. And this is a concept known as undercranking. So Fincher has this idea, and now he's like, well, I need to rent out the equipment. So he calls up his friend who works at the matte department for Industrial Light and Magic. And if you're not aware, Industrial Light and Magic are the goats of VFX. They pioneered so much stuff. They're responsible for Star Wars, E.T., Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park, the goats. So Fincher's talking to his friend and he's like, yeah, let me know when you guys are done with that Steadicam equipment because I've got this idea for this undercrank Steadicam thing in a sequence I'm working on. And his friend is like, who told you about that? And Fincher is like, no one. This is just an original idea that I have. And his friend is like, I can't talk to you, man. I gotta call you back. About an hour later, Fincher gets a call back from Industrial Light and Magic. But this time it isn't his friend. On the other end of the phone is none other than Dennis Muren. And I'll pull up his letterboxd, but this man is a VFX legend. He has 9 Oscars. How many Oscars does one man need? That is insane. And at this point in time, Dennis Muren is like the man at Industrial Light and Magic. And the first thing that Dennis Muren says to Fincher is, who told you about the undercrank Steadicam stuff? And Fincher is like, no one. It is just an idea that I had. Because the thing is that at the exact same time that Fincher has this idea to use the undercrank Steadicam, Industrial Light and Magic has secretly been experimenting with the exact same technique for the speeder bike sequence on Return of the Jedi. And suffice to say, Dennis Muren is impressed. And so not too long after this phone call, David Fincher gets hired, working for Industrial Light and Magic. And one of the first things that he works on while he's there is Return of the Jedi. The chicken walkers, that's David Fincher. He shot those bad boys on a blue screen. And so now Fincher's working at Industrial Light and Magic, and he is just surrounded by and learning from the most talented people at the forefront of the VFX industry. Fincher said, quote, I was one of those kids who was really committed to the idea of being on sets and watching how shit went down. I watched a lot of directors, talented people that I liked and admired, get kind of spun and worked. And I vowed never to let that happen. I was like, I want to know what every motherfucker in the room does. And at the same time that Fincher is working at ILM, on the weekends, he's still developing his own ideas and trying to sell them. He's on that grind set. And then in 1984, along with some friends, Fincher develops this idea for an anti-smoking PSA. And it involved a very striking image of a fetus smoking a cigarette in utero. And I'll put up an image, and Fincher manages to successfully sell this idea to the American Cancer Society. They shoot the ad for $8,000, and when they deliver it, the American Cancer Society is like, oh, damn, that's pretty full on. but they decide to air it. And this becomes kind of a big controversy. Like, there were some TV stations that just flat out refused to run the ad. And then the news media started picking this up and covering it, and it became a story. And if you've never seen this ad before, you can look it up on YouTube. Super easy to find. And because of the stir that this ad had created, Fincher started getting a lot of attention, particularly from producers. And this time in the early to mid 80s is when Fincher makes his foray into directing music videos. And this is where he's going to spend a lot of time honing in on his craft. Fincher said, quote, "Music videos for me was like film school. It's like somebody was going to pay for me to play." And early on into this venture, while Fincher was looking for work, he has his agent approach all the music video production companies with his reel. And at this time in the 80s, the biggest top dog in music video production was a company known as Limelight. Like, they were working on stuff with Prince, Michael Jackson, Madonna, David Bowie. And Fincher's reel makes it into the hands of the head of Limelight, Simon Fields. Simon Fields watches Fincher's reel and sends a letter back to Fincher's agent that says something along the lines of, "This guy has no talent. We have no interest." And Fincher has a quote that goes unnecessarily hard. He said this, quote, "I vowed at that moment to dance in the ruins of Limelight." So in 1986, Fincher teams up with some producers and commercial directors, and they found their very own commercial and music video production company, and this is called Propaganda Films. And as you can see, this becomes a pretty significant part of Fincher's career. To put it lightly, Propaganda Films was a success. Fincher said, quote, "We went from billing together about $2.5 million a year, and 3 years later, we were billing $75 million a year, and we had the biggest music video commercial company in Hollywood." And there's a ton of notable filmmakers who worked with Propaganda Films early in their career. You've got Spike Jonze, Gore Verbinski, Michael Bay, and Zack Snyder. And then in the early 90s, Propaganda Films dips their toe into producing movies, and they team up with David Lynch, and they produce Wild at Heart. And then Propaganda Films produce Twin Peaks. I didn't know that. That is one of the facts of the video. That is so cool. Also, Twin Peaks would make it for a really good video in this format. But it would take me so long to make. But at this point in the late 80s, early 90s, Fincher wasn't associated with movies yet. I mean, not like how he is today. If you knew David Fincher's name, you would have thought, oh, that's the music video guy. And across his career, David Fincher has directed 56 music videos. Just to list off a few of the bangers, we've got, where are we? Vogue by Madonna, Janie's Got a Gun by Aerosmith, Who Is It by Michael Jackson, and Love Is Strong by the Rolling Stones. Then in 1990, 20th Century Fox hire music video director David Fincher to direct what would be his first feature-length film, their upcoming sequel, Alien 3. And this takes us into Alien 3 Hell. So if you haven't seen Alien 3 before, I'm not going to spoil it, and we're going to breeze through this section pretty quickly, but I think it's important to talk about because it's integral to Fincher's story, but also it sets up where he was at going into the making of Se7en. Also, it's insane and fun. To sum up the production of Alien 3 in one word, cooked. Fincher has described the experience of directing Alien 3 across multiple different interviews as, quote, "being sodomized ritualistically for 2 years. And today, Fincher has basically disavowed Alien 3. He will not talk about it ever. It's basically like the movie never existed. It's sort of like, so in 1986, Aliens was a huge hit, and now 20th Century Fox was really keen to revive the franchise. And the first director they reach out to do the movie is the legendary Ridley Scott, who had directed the first Alien movie. And Scott's kind of interested, but because of some scheduling conflicts, ultimately he passes on the project. And from then until this movie's completion, just pandemonium. Before landing on David Fincher to direct, the studio went through a total of 5 writers and 2 directors. Someone would develop a unique take on Alien 3, write an entire screenplay, then there would be creative conflict between the studio and the filmmaker, and they would either be fired, replaced, and or leave. And this went on for years. And there are so many different versions of what this movie could have been. I think the most interesting one involves a wooden planet that was populated by monks. But what we end up with is a blend of ideas from all of the previous screenplays. Except by the time that they start shooting in January of 1991, the screenplay is still unfinished. And at this point, Fox had already spent $7 million. So it's not going great. And this project is really not the pressure chamber that you want to throw yourself into as a first-time director of a feature-length film. Enter David Fincher. So after all these conflicts that Fox had had with other filmmakers, they come up with this idea. What if we just hire a small-time director who will be appreciative of this opportunity to direct a big franchise movie? Someone who will listen to us, we can control, someone who will be subservient. And so from their end, it made sense. Hire a music video director. Except they made one slight miscalculation, because the music video director that they hired is David motherfucking Fincher. The antithesis of everything I just listed. So Fincher joins production, the script is still unfinished, and Fincher tours the sets. And then a new draft of the screenplay is written based upon these sets. The draft is then deemed so bad that production shuts down for 3 months while they write a new one. Then 2 weeks into production, the cinematographer Jordan Cronenworth had to leave it because he was suffering from Parkinson's disease. When production eventually does resume, it's freezing. They're shooting in England, and the winter of 1990 to 1991 is infamous. Parts of the country are covered in up to 8 inches of snow, which is an amount of snowfall that England would not see again until 2009. And because it's so cold, the cast and crew are constantly getting sick. And at the same time, there's still no finished script. So scenes are constantly being taken away, then re-added, shot, and then reshot. It's chaos. And then there's the studio intervention. So every night after wrap, Fincher had to call the studio and tell them the day's happenings, to which they would tell him, okay, well, you have to cut this, you have to change this, etc., etc. It got to the point where the studio hired a watchdog to follow Fincher around, listen to him direct, and then after Fincher would leave the set, the watchdog would tell the crew which directions they actually were and weren't allowed to follow. It's pretty messed up. But Fincher goes big brain, and to counteract this, he shuts down second unit production so that he can personally monitor every frame that's being shot. And because of this, the budget and schedule continue to balloon. When they get to the edit, the studio hates the first cut, and they argue at length with Fincher about how it should turn out. When Fincher does make a suggestion, the studio usually doesn't accept it, only to then later realize, oh, he was right about that one. But at this point, they've wasted even more money reshooting and recutting. By the time an ending is decided upon, Sigourney Weaver's hair had begun to grow back, and because there was a clause in her contract that said every time they shaved her head, she would receive $40,000, Fox was like, screw that, and so they spent $20,000 making a custom bald cap for her. Alien 3 is released in May of 1992. It underperforms at the box office and receives poor reviews. But at this point, Fincher has long left the project and disowned it completely. And even today, like I said, he won't mention it in interviews. He's never been featured on a commentary track or participated in any of the special features. It just doesn't exist to him. And despite all of this, I just want to take a moment to say, I had never seen Alien 3 until doing research for this video. And my entire life, I have heard about how bad it is. It averages, I think, a 2.8 on Letterboxd. And so I watched it, and I don't think it's that bad, especially considering everything we just talked about. And I say this as somebody who enjoys the first 2 Alien movies, and by no means is this as good as those, but hot take of the video, I think Alien 3 is surprisingly kind of good. I feel like it's a deeply misunderstood film, but look, hey, let me know what you think in the comments. Roast me. Still, this experience discouraged David Fincher from ever directing another feature-length film again. And Fincher, the man just has fire quotes today. He said, quote, "I'd rather die of colon cancer than make another movie." And so that's it. David Fincher never directed another feature-length film again, and he faded away into the obscurity of cinema history. Is what happened on the alternate timeline. But in this timeline, a script comes along his desk that changes everything. And that leads us into Se7en. And we have to start with the screenplay that came out of seemingly nowhere and the man behind it. Andrew Kevin Walker. Andrew Kevin Walker was born on August 14th, 1964, and he grows up in the small town of Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Walker said, quote, "It was like a weird thing, kind of a faraway dream to say, well, I want to work in the film industry." After high school, Walker studies film at Penn State, and it's there that he ends up having a really good screenwriting teacher in Jeff Rogers, who encourages him, and this really pushes Walker to focus and drill down on his writing. And it's during college that Walker writes his very first feature-length screenplay, but of course at this point, they're not really going anywhere. And after college, Walker moves from Pennsylvania to New York to try to get his foot in the door of the film industry. And while he's there, he's in the trenches. He's working as a PA on film sets, and he's also working for a low-budget production company that specializes in straight-to-VHS horror and exploitation movies. But this isn't really paying the bills. So to support himself, Walker ends up getting a full-time job working at Tower Records, which he would do during the day, and then at night when he got home, he would sit down and work on these screenplays. But he's only just scraping by, and he's absolutely miserable in New York. And from the way that he describes it in interviews, I get the sense that living in New York in the early 90s was pretty tough. Walker said that he would often see, quote, random ordinary injustices, and there were, quote, times when you think, I just kind of want to quit. I don't care why I'm here. I just want to kind of go live a different existence. But he doesn't go full Travis Bickle, and he doesn't go full John Doe. Instead, he writes a movie about it, and he channels his dissonance with New York into the writing of Se7en. Now, the idea for Se7en first comes to Walker when he's working on those low-budget horror movies. Walker said, quote, "They wanted to do a movie called Abusement Park, where all the rides are dangerously wounding to the people who are riding them. So that was kind of the mindset I was in. It was a very exploitational mindset. And I came up with this idea for 7 murders, 7 deadly sins. And you know, it's like a very exploitational idea. One sentency, graspable, you know, it has a hook to it. It began with that, and I sat down just to make this kind of straight serial killer 7 deadly sins thing. And it became a little bit more than that, I hope. Because as I was writing, I feel like I just expressed certain things about living in New York City." And remember that at this point, Andrew Kevin Walker is not associated with Hollywood or the studio system. He's just a guy who in the evening, when his shift is over, is writing this screenplay. So the idea that this movie would get a $30 million budget, become Oscar nominated, and gross over $300 million is not on the cards. So Walker chips away at the Se7en screenplay for 5 months. And once it's finished, he realizes like it could be something. Like this could be my ticket to a professional writing career. Walker said, quote, "And by the time I'd finished it, there was a whole other journey to be taken. Trying to find an agent for it, trying to get it out there, especially to get it from New York to LA." So how does he pull this off? Well, this point in the early 90s was the golden age of the spec script. Unlike today, studios are focused on IP-driven, eventized movies that make $500 million to break even. Or if it's not that, it's very low budget or tool-driven indie films, and that makes up most of what comes out. Sadly, the $50 million star-driven genre film doesn't really exist anymore. But in 1990, it is very much a thing. So if a solid script came along with a good concept, even if it was from an unknown writer, a studio might still buy or option that screenplay, and if they could get a big star attached to be in it, they would be comfortable putting $50 million behind it, because if the movie doubles its money, that was considered a success. And Se7en is a prime example of this, except it's going to do a lot more than just double its money. And in a relatively short period of time, Walker is able to find an agent for the screenplay, and pretty soon interest comes in from Italian production company Penta Film. And for this, Walker is paid the Writers Guild of America minimum, which based upon the Pulp Fiction video, I think is about $30,000, which for Walker at this point in time was a lot of money. And this is his shot, and he knows it, and he goes for it. He takes the $30,000, quits his job at Tower Records, and relocates to LA, where he can devote himself entirely to working on Se7en. And this takes us into what I want to call Pre-Fincher Se7en. So it's the early 90s now, and at this point, Fincher is not involved in the project at all. On the timeline, he's probably on the set of Alien 3 getting sodomized. Ritualistically, of course. And so Pentafilm line up Jeremiah S. Chechik to direct Seven, who at this point had directed one film prior, but had been a big hit. And that was National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. And I'm now saying that the red thread is connecting the wrong person. The whiteboard's not perfect, but I try. And it's like Christmas Vacation, Seven, like different vibes to say the least. But that was sort of the point, because Chechik wanted to break out of the typecast of a comedy director. So it's like, okay, I'll make a serial killer movie, and that's the play. Still though, Chechik had very different sensibilities to what Fincher would eventually bring to the project, and they were also very far removed from Andrew Kevin Walker's original vision. And I think now is a good time to point out that Fincher and Walker make for a really good duo because they have similar tastes, and that's why they've continued to collaborate throughout their career. But when it comes to Chechik, in the case of Seven, it's not really aligned with Walker's vision. And so Chechik, along with Pentafilm, request extensive changes be made to the screenplay. And because this is Walker's big break, it's his first time working in Hollywood, he's like, okay, I'll do it. And this is a lengthy process that ends up resulting in somewhere around 12 or 13 different versions of the Seven screenplay. Andrew Kevin Walker said, quote, "The Jeremiah Chechik draft was off the rails, completely different. And it's weird to even think back that I'm the one, like I say, good little screenwriter, good little soldier, took Chechik's notes and went and wrote them. I've gotten a lot more persnickety since then." Which, if you know anything about 8mm lore, very true. So what did the Jeremiah Chechik version of Seven look like? Well, the dark elements were toned down, the action was pumped up, and it fell in line with more traditional police movies of the time. And the biggest and most contentious point was changes made to the ending, which is something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. And I haven't said this yet, but big spoilers upcoming. So if you somehow haven't seen Seven yet, but you're watching this part of the video, I would hate to rob you of a spoiler-free Seven experience. So please go watch it first, and then if you remember, come back and I'll keep yapping. Okay, and now we're back. So in the revised Chechik version, there is no head in the box. And then instead of the ending being set out in that arid landscape under the power lines, it's set in an abandoned church. And I saw in different places that the church may or may not be on fire at the same time as the ending is happening. And then instead of Mills killing Doe, John Doe kills Mills. And then Somerset kills John Doe. And meanwhile, Tracy escapes from the city. She's chilling. When asked in an interview by Uproxx what he changed the ending to, Andrew Kevin Walker said, quote, "I don't want to go into it too much because looking back on it, I just go, why did I rewrite this for them? Why didn't I just storm off and say, look, I won't rewrite this. This changes too much. But the thing to remember is if I didn't stick around, then I likely wouldn't have been around when it came back around to Fincher. I'll just say that it involved, as I remember it, an abandoned church, and the 7 deadly sins were depicted in a kind of tableau of paintings. And I don't believe there was any head in the box or anything. There was just a confrontation in an abandoned church. It sounds like the end of Batman." And around the time of these rewrites, well before Fincher was involved, there was a pretty big movie star who was attached to play Detective Mills. And this one blew my mind when I first saw it, but the movie star who was attached to play Detective Mills was none other than Denzel Washington. And Denzel is actually part of the reason why the script was rewritten so many times, because he himself had also requested changes be made. David Fincher said, quote, "I was told that Denzel had read the script, didn't like it, and that the script was rewritten like 10 or 11 times to suit him. It was rewritten ad nauseum, ad infinitum, in an attempt to get Denzel to say yes. By the time I got involved, Denzel had long passed." So what did Denzel Washington say about all of this? Well, there's this YouTube video from 2018 where Jamie Foxx asked Denzel if there's any roles that he regrets turning down. And Denzel said, quote, "7. He adds, quote, "They wanted me to play the Brad Pitt part. I thought the script was too demonic. Then I saw the movie. I was like, oh, I blew it." And it does maybe seem like this is a regret that Denzel still lives with. I mean, he's done at least 3 movies since that try to recapture the magic of Seven. You've got Fallen from 1998, The Bone Collector from 1999, and then 2 decades later, he does Little Things. And your mileage may vary on some of these movies. It's a shame that Little Things blows ass. Why is the script so not good. And I'm sure Denzel is not losing any sleep over this. I mean, he is Denzel Washington. But look, maybe if he wants to give it another crack, do a season of True Detective maybe. That could hit. And while I'm thinking about it, True Detective season 1 video could go kind of hard. Look, let me know in the comments. Or you could suggest any movie or TV show or like video game. I'm open to suggestions. And I do try to read the comments. Like there's not that much to read, to be honest. So back to this early version of 7, and the rewrites are not going great, and the option is about to expire. And on top of this, Pentafilm is financially in the hole. Just down, just in the hole. So Pentafilm end up selling 7 to producer Arnold Kopelson. And remember this man, because he ties back into the story shortly. And so Kopelson takes 7 to New Line Cinema, who get on board to make the movie. But at this point in time, New Line was a smaller studio. This is like pre-Lord of the Rings New Line. And their bread and butter at this time was independent cinema and horror movies. For example, they worked with John Waters on Pink Flamingos, which shout out to the weird cult movie Iceberg. And their big franchise was Nightmare on Elm Street. So after they acquire 7, New Line budgets $31 million towards it. And Fincher's gonna push this a little bit, but at the time, this was the biggest budget the New Line had ever put behind a project. And it was seen as a risk, especially when you consider, on paper, how not broadly appealing 7 should be. And when New Line enters the picture, Jeremiah Chechik leaves the project. And so now it's up to New Line to find a new director. And one of the first people that they offer it to is Guillermo del Toro, which is interesting, you know, let him cook. But Del Toro, similar to Denzel, passes on it because he finds the script too dark and too harsh, which is interesting coming from him, but okay. The next person New Line offers it to is director Phil Janot. And I think I've butchered his name, but we're just gonna roll with it. God, the whiteboard's not making any sense right now. And at this point, he was probably best known for directing some of U2's music videos, which is kind of sick. I've had a U2 phase. I will admit that. Sometimes I listen to one and it gives me chills, okay? And also, Phil Janot directed the music video for one. But the reason that New Line wanted him was because he had directed a neo-noir film previously called State of Grace. And this movie stars Sean Penn. It's concerning now, I'm not going to get into it, but because of this movie, they felt that he would be a good fit for 7. But similar to everyone else up until this point, he turns down the movie because it's too dark. And look, in retrospect, fat L's for these directors, but it does make you realize just how on a knife's edge all the pieces are when they're falling into place, and that there's a bit of luck involved with getting a movie this good. And so now we cut back to David Fincher. It's the mid-90s now, and he has no aspirations for directing a feature-length movie, but Fincher's agent is still receiving screenplays. And when the screenplay for 7 comes across his desk, he's like, you know what? I'm gonna send this one along. And I'm not gonna beat Fincher's telling of this story, so let's just do that. Straight from the source. Fincher said, quote, Richard Lovett sent it to me and he said, you know, New Line is making this movie and you know, you may be able to get a job at New Line. You should read this script. I got about 13 pages into it and I thought, it's the young cop, old cop thing. And so I called him and said, you know, young cop, old cop, I'm not really that. And he said, no. Keep reading it. So I said, oh, all right. So I went back and I got like 85, 90 pages into it. And all of a sudden, John Doe gives himself up. And I was going, where do I go to make the movie? Where the serial killer shows up of his own volition and says, hey, stop me. I'm begging you, stop me before I kill again. And he's covered in blood. And you just go, you know, sign me up. And so I called my agent and I said, you're right. Fuck, this is great. How do I get involved? I love this ending. It's amazing. The head in the box. And he said, whoa, wait a minute. The head in the box, what are you talking about? And I said, the ending with the head in the box. And he goes, no. I'm sorry, I sent you the wrong draft. That was like the first draft. There's been like 9 subsequent drafts. So I was like, okay, maybe it gets better. So they sent me the 11th draft or whatever, and it was the young cop jumping in the speeding car, running traffic lights, flashing his badge while his wife takes a bath in a white terry cloth robe, gets into a shower or whatever, and a guy jimmies the window open in the back. And I just thought, I was so excited. What happened? So I called him and said, this is awful, and this is terrible. And how do I do the first draft? And he said, Well, go talk to DeLuca. Now, DeLuca refers to Michael DeLuca, who was the president of production at New Line Cinema, and he is one of the champions of Fincher's vision and the original ending of Se7en. But then on the other side of the fence is Arnold Kopelson, who we talked about earlier, and he prefers the rewritten, more risk-averse and less depraved version. Fincher said, quote, "So I went and I sat down with Mike and I said, I love this first draft and I hate everything that happened to it after that." And he said, "Great, me too. That's why we bought it." And I said, "Fantastic. So you'd make the first draft?" And he said, "Yeah, but don't tell Arnold." He says, "You've got to go meet with Arnold and you got to go pitch your wares. But I'm with you." Fincher continues, quote, "So I went and I met with Arnold and I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, absolutely not. No way. There's not a chance." He looked me right in the eye, "Because this movie will never end with a head in the box. You know, I swear that's the last thing we would ever allow." So I started thinking about it and I thought, there's a way this can make sense. There's a way eventually. I kind of love reading quotes. I'm having way too much fun with this. So how does Fincher get the head in the box ending across the line then? Well, we need to bring in the cavalry. Enter Brad Pitt. Now, coming into 1995, Brad Pitt was not Brad Pitt yet, but his star was on the rise in a pretty crazy way. He just had a banger year coming off of Legends of the Fall and Interview with a Vampire, which, whether or not you think that movie works fully, in terms of star making, starring alongside Tom Cruise in a big hit is validation that you've got the juice. And when it comes to persuading studio executives and producers on things like heads in boxes, the juice matters. Fincher recounted, quote, "So Brad had signed on at that point, and Brad had read the original, the first version, the first draft, and he was like, I want to do it. It's great." And I told him, I said, Arnold's not keen on the head in the box. He said, "I'm not doing it unless it's the head in the box version. I wouldn't be interested in making any other version of this movie." This could totally be an episode of The Studio. And from everything that I've read and heard, it just sounds like Brad Pitt has really good instincts. I mean, the reason that he wanted to do Se7en in the first place was to avoid becoming typecast as the romantic lead, which he was definitely at risk of prior because he looks like Brad Pitt. And it's that thing that people always say, he's a character actor trapped in a leading man's body. But what I think it really is he just has good instincts and good taste. And you see this throughout his career. I mean, low key, Brad Pitt is one of the most exciting producers in Hollywood. Look at all the movies his company, Plan B Entertainment, has done. He was an executive producer in Adolescence. Where is the crystal ball hidden? Tell me, I need it. Now, the next piece in the puzzle was getting Morgan Freeman, which at the time seemed unlikely that Morgan Freeman would be interested in such a dark and gritty film. Mid-1990s Morgan Freeman carries a level of prestige about him. He's a 3-time Oscar-nominated actor at this point. He's coming off the back of The Shawshank Redemption, which maybe at some point, Fincher said, quote, "I never would have dreamed that Morgan Freeman would be interested." And Arnold Kopelson slipped him the script. He called me, "What do you think of Morgan Freeman?" And I was like, oh my God, are you kidding? It's too mean, it's too cruel, it's too vicious a movie. And so he called me back the next day and he said he read it and he likes it. And I was just like, and it kind of put into perspective, there's an incredible empathy that Morgan has. And it's funny that Kopelson is the one who suggested Morgan Freeman, because Freeman is going to be one of the voices who pushes for the original head in the box ending. Fincher said, quote, "And Morgan signed on, Morgan said the same thing. And I think about 2 months into the prep and a couple of weeks before we started shooting, we went and we had a meeting with Kopelson. And I just said, long after we're all gone, 50, 60 years from now, a bunch of 20-somethings are going to be at a cocktail party talking about a movie that they saw on the Late Show the night before. And someone's going to go, I don't remember the name of the actor, but it's the one where the van pulls up at the end and the guy has the head in the box. The head in the box movie." And I said, this is the head in the box movie. And so the ending was decided upon, or at least the box was. There's still about 4 different permeations of how the ending could have gone, and we'll dive into those after. But first, let's take a peek into the alternate timelines and have a look at the casting. So let's start with Detective David Mills. Now, we talked about how Denzel Washington had the part for a period of time, but early on, another actor who was offered the part was Sylvester Stallone. The only quote I could find from Stallone about this comes from an article from 2006 that I found on a very old website. And he said this, quote, "There are several films I missed out on and wished I'd done. Coming Home, Witness, and Se7en. Now, it's a very different movie with Stallone in the Brad Pitt part. I mean, maybe a younger Stallone could work, but mid-90s, Sly, I don't know what they were thinking. Let's talk about Somerset. So back in New York, when Andrew Kevin Walker was writing Se7en, in his head he pictured in the role of Somerset, William Hurt. So early on into production, William Hurt is offered the role, but he turns it down. Now this one makes sense to me if it's an older William Hurt. I mean, I can totally see that. But in 1995, Hurt was only 45 years old, whereas Freeman was 58. And I think for Somerset, who's a retiring detective, I think 45 is a bit too young. Another actor who was offered the role of Somerset was Al Pacino. And I mean, he's got a few of these noirs under his belt, so he totally would have been great. But he turns down the role to do another movie that comes out in 1995. It's a little movie called Heat. So suffice to say, I think the stars aligned on this one and there's no regrets. Robert Duvall was also considered for the role of Somerset. And then the last Hollywood legend that was approached was Gene Hackman. I put him in the wrong section on the whiteboard. Unfortunate. David Fincher said, quote, "I was interested in Gene Hackman and I met with him for about 20 minutes and Gene said, 'I don't shoot nights.' I said, 'It's been lovely meeting you. I'm a huge fan, but half the movie takes place at night. There's no changing that.' But along comes Morgan Freeman. And I mean, he is Somerset. All of these actors are amazing, but in terms of this movie, I think we really did get the best version of it. So most of these actors turned down the movie because they thought that it was too dark. And I was curious to see if Morgan Freeman had any thoughts on this. And I found something in a 1995 interview he did with Bobby Wygant. So basically Wygant is like, "Se7en's a pretty dark and violent movie, don't you think?" To which Freeman responds with, quote, "No, I don't think so. I mean, I made the movie. I agreed to do the movie because I thought it was within the parameters of my taste in terms of how much violence or gruesomeness I can stand. But you know, you can't speak for other people's parameters. So no, I don't think it's too much. We were kind of holding it down. You know, you don't see any of the violence, you only see the aftermath." So now let's take a quick look at Tracy Mills. Now it's pretty hard to separate Gwyneth Paltrow from Se7en, especially because of the ending. But before they landed on Paltrow, Fincher actually auditioned over 100 people. Among these included Robin Wright and Christina Applegate, who was actually offered the role, but ended up turning it down. Now, back in 1994, when they were casting the movie Legends of the Fall, Brad Pitt met Gwyneth Paltrow. And even though she didn't get cast in the movie, Pitt was really impressed with her audition. And it was after this that they ended up dating. And they were one of the more high-profile celebrity couples of the time. So during the casting for Tracy, Brad Pitt mentions Gwyneth Paltrow, and Fincher is actually pretty keen on casting her, but for whatever reason, everyone sort of decides that she probably wouldn't be interested. I mean, it's pretty heavy stuff. So they end up going through this lengthy audition process, not really getting anywhere, and towards the end of it, they set up a meeting with Gwyneth Paltrow, and to everyone's surprise, she agrees to do the movie. Gwyneth Paltrow described the script of Se7en as, quote, "a pretty traumatic read," end quote. But then she goes on to talk about how while they were filming it, the experience itself was pretty lighthearted and understated, and that there was never a moment where it felt like they were making a borderline horror movie. And I do feel that because Brad and Gwyneth were dating at the time, something does come through in their chemistry in the movie. Their relationship does feel real and lived in, and I think it adds even more gravity to an already devastating ending. And finally, let's talk about John Doe. And just quick PSA at the top here, but the Kevin Spacey thing is so unfortunate. It's such a filmography to have like tainted in ick. I think specifically in the case of Se7en, it doesn't get in the way of my experience of the film. I think that's because John Doe is such a highly unsympathetic character. But I bring this up because if it sounds like I'm glazing Kevin Spacey, it's only in relationship to the performance in the movie, and not in relationship to his performance in real life. Now, Kevin Spacey was not the first choice for John Doe, and we have a myriad of potential Does to look at. And I mean, they're all really different from each other. And I think some of them are super unique takes. So initially, Andrew Kevin Walker and David Fincher wanted John Doe to be played by Ned Beatty, which I think, fuck yeah, that is a scary John Doe. I mean, John Doe's already scary, but damn. And the reason that they wanted to cast Ned Beatty was because they thought that he resembled the famous police sketch of the Zodiac Killer. And I'll pull it up on the screen somewhere. I don't really see it, to be honest. But hey, look, any excuse to cast Ned Beatty is a valid one. Fincher said, quote, "I wanted and Andy originally wanted Ned Beatty. It was oddly based on the wanted or the police drawing of Zodiac. This guy with a crew cut and horn-rimmed glasses. That was the vision. He should look like a poster." So they do that. They offer the role of John Doe to Ned Beatty. And apparently he considers it for like a weekend, but ultimately he turns it down. Beatty said that the Se7en script was the, quote, "most evil thing I've ever read." And this is coming from a guy who was in Deliverance. So now the next person who was considered for John Doe, and this one blew my mind, was Michael Stipe, the lead singer of REM. Now Michael Stipe turns down the role because the production dates conflict with the dates of REM's tour that they were going on at the time. Now, firstly, Michael Stipe kind of has the John Doe look nailed, just off rip. But I was like, Michael Stipe's not an actor, is he? He doesn't act. So I looked it up and he doesn't have any acting credits outside of REM music videos. So then that makes me wonder how this idea even came up on Fincher's radar. Was it because he was a music video director and maybe like he was somehow associated with REM at some point? I don't know. But if Michael Stipe played John Doe and the performance was good, surely Michael Stipe would have gone on to play more roles in more movies, like sort of like a David Bowie type thing. So the question is, have we been robbed of a bountiful Michael Stipe acting career? That's all I'm saying. So apparently at the time that Michael Stipe was approached to play John Doe, the dialogue for the character was pretty minimal. Michael Stipe said, quote, "All I had to do was run down some hallways and look scary." Christopher Guest was somebody who was also considered for the role of John Doe. And now this next one, I think is probably the coolest one. Considered for the role of John Doe and declined it was prime 1990s Val Kilmer. He would have been playing against type, but I think it would have been really interesting. It does raise one question though. What happens to this movie if you make John Doe hot? Is John Doe allowed to be hot? I mean, I think it puts an interesting twist on the whole incel vibe that he's got going on. Now, I'm pretty sure that the reason that Val Kilmer turned the role down was so that he could do Heat. So once again, no complaints here. I think we are on the right timeline. Now, Ali Ermey, who is best known for giving one of the most iconic performances ever as Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket, auditioned for John Doe. Now, he didn't get the part, but he does still end up in Se7en playing the police chief. And he has a bunch of great little moments. For example, when the phone rings and he picks it up and he's like, "This isn't even my desk." And it is pretty wild to imagine Sergeant Hartman as John Doe. It's quite frightening. And I absolutely love Fincher's description of Ermey's audition for John Doe. Fincher said this, quote, "He came in to read for John Doe initially, and it was kind of amazing. He was a very distinct and amazing take on John Doe because he was fucking Marine Corps drill sergeant. You know, he made John Doe into this guy who was so unsympathetic. Not that Kevin's, that much more sympathetic. It was like so cut and dry, with Lee. And we had cast Kevin. So I said, 'You want to play the police chief?' And he was like, 'Yeah, all right, I'll do it.' And this gets us into the casting of Kevin Spacey as John Doe. Now, the story's a little bit different depending on if you get Fincher's version or Kevin Spacey's version. And we'll cover them both, but let's start with Spacey's. Spacey said, quote, "I went into audition for David Fincher in probably late November of '94, and I auditioned for this part and didn't get it. Then I went back to New York, and I think they started shooting December 12th. So then we fast forward to December 23rd, and Spacey said, quote, "It's like 7 o'clock at night and my phone rings, and it's Arnold Kopelson, who's the producer of Se7en, and he's very jovial and he's very friendly, and he says, 'How are you doing?' And I said, 'Fine.' And he said, 'Listen, do you remember that film you came in for, Se7en?' And I said, yeah, absolutely.' And he goes, 'Well, turns out we hired an actor and we started shooting. And then yesterday, David fired him. And David would like you to get on a plane on Sunday and come to Los Angeles and start shooting on Tuesday.' And so they send the screenplay to Spacey, he catches a plane, and a couple of days later, he's on the set shooting Se7en. And this story is super interesting because if true, it means that Spacey gives this amazing performance with basically no prep. It's like he gets a call on the weekend, rocks up Tuesday, and then just steals the movie. And the other thing is that if we take Spacey's recount as verbatim, that means that there was an actor who was originally cast to play John Doe who was fired. This raises the question, who was this other actor? We don't know. That's the thing. It's one of the enduring mysteries of the production of this film. And it might not even be true. But let him cook. Because on the subreddit r/blankies, user Generous Bear posted a newspaper clipping that might hold the answer. It reads, quote, "For an independent, New Line continues to be more active than many major studios. The indie is zeroing in on Tom Hulce to join Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman for the David Fincher directed thriller Se7en." Now, this is purely speculation, but the best guess we have is that if there was an actor who was cast to play John Doe and was fired, it was most likely Tom Hulce. Once again, completely speculation. No way to confirm this. So maybe if someone knows a little bit more, could put something in the comments, that would be great. So let's take a look at what Fincher had to say about Spacey's retelling of events. Fincher said, quote, "That was an interesting thing because I had read this article where Spacey was talking about how he had cast someone else and how he ended up getting a call at the last minute to come in and play John Doe, which I thought was so strange that he remembers it that way." And then Brad Pitt adds, quote, "We fought for him." So according to Fincher, Kevin Spacey came in pretty early on to audition for John Doe and he killed it. Fincher described it as, quote, "We put a video camera on him, we did 2 takes and you just went, okay, that part's cast." So Fincher goes to the studio to try to secure Kevin Spacey as John Doe. And the studio is like, "He's too expensive. We can't afford him. Just go away, get someone else." And you've got to remember at the time, the $31 million budget was the largest budget New Line had ever put towards a movie. And that $31 million was spread thin. There was nothing left. And so they go back to the drawing board. They hold all of these auditions, but production is getting closer. And eventually it's Brad Pitt who is like, "What are we doing? Spacey's audition was amazing." So now Brad Pitt goes to the studio and he's like, "Guys, what are we doing? We're not here to fuck spiders. Can we please get Kevin Spacey in this movie immediately?" That's not a direct quote. And so the studio is like, "Ah, yes, Brad Pitt, you do make a compelling argument." And so New Line does extend the budget of Se7en and they end up getting Kevin Spacey. And that's the power of a true movie star. They do have a lot of sway when it comes to the decisions that are made in the production of a film. Now, I don't have an exact figure of how much Kevin Spacey was paid for his 20 minutes of screen time, but what we do know is that the initial budget for Se7en was $31 million. And it ended up being closer to $33 million. They still had to pay for the helicopter at the end of the film that wasn't budgeted in initially. So if I were to take a guess, I would say that Kevin Spacey was paid somewhere around $1 million. So for 20 minutes of screen time, not bad. And another one of those legendary Today I Learned facts about Se7en is that Kevin Spacey refused billing on the movie. And this was an idea that David Fincher also had, but it was really Spacey who pushed for it. And the reason that they did this was to keep the identity of the killer secret. And so if you look at any of the box art or posters or promotional materials for Se7en, you won't find Kevin Spacey's name. And well, unless you're on Netflix, they love to spoil everything. Kevin Spacey said, quote, "I had this feeling, I can't even quite describe it, but I had this feeling that it would be really good if I didn't take billing in the film. And the reason I felt that was because that I knew that by the time this film would come out, it would be one of the 3 movies I had just shot, the 4th one. And if any of those films broke through or did well, if it was going to be Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Kevin Spacey, and you don't show up for the first 25, 30, 40 minutes, people are going to figure out who you're playing." And I think it's worth pointing out that mid-90s Kevin Spacey had this run of movies where he played characters that there was more to them than what appeared. I don't want to spoil these films if you haven't seen them, but the expectation was, if Kevin Spacey's in a movie, there was probably going to be a surprise. So it made a lot of sense, this whole not billing his name on the poster. But New Line was not enthused, especially after they spent all this money getting Kevin Spacey. And it's like, what, we can't use his name? Spacey said, quote, "And so New Line Cinema told me to go fuck myself, that they absolutely could use my picture and my image. And this became a little bit of, I'd say, a 24-hour conversation. And it was Fincher who actually said, I think this is a really cool idea. So the compromise was I'm the first credit at the end of the movie when the credits start." So before they start shooting Se7en, Fincher and Spacey are in the makeup trailer figuring out how John Doe should look, what's the vibe. And Spacey describes it like this. He said, quote, I just had my hair short for Outbreak because I was playing a military character. And I just looked at the hairdresser and I said, "Do you have a razor?" And Fincher went, "Are you kidding?" And I said, "No." He goes, "If you shave your head, I'll shave mine." And so we both shaved our heads, and then I started shooting the next day. Principal photography took place from December 12th, 1994 through to March 10, 1995. And so now let's dive into the look of Seven and the cinematography, because it is an undeniably beautiful movie to look at. There's a Rolodeck of certain shots from movies that lives rent-free in my head, and just Seven itself has several entries on it. The director of photography on Seven was Darius Khondji, who is stealthily one of the best working cinematographers at the moment. Not only does he have wall-to-wall classics spanning decades, but the stuff he's working on now is just as interesting. He's working with the top tier directors, Bong Joon-ho, Ari Aster, and later this year he's doing the cinematography on the Josh Safdie directed movie Marty Supreme, starring Timothée Chalamet. And the man did Seven. I found this amazing article from 1995 by American cinematographer that goes into an incredible amount of detail about the cinematography on Seven. I'll link it in the description, but here are the big points. So Darius Khondji said that he had always had this fascination with horror movies and that he'd always dreamt of making a movie like Seven. He first meets David Fincher in the late 1980s when they worked together shooting a commercial for Nike. Fast forward to the 90s, and Khondji has some experience under his belt, having shot the feature-length film Delicatessen. And it's on this movie that he develops a contrast manipulating processing technique that he goes on to use on Seven. Khondji said, quote, "And we then took that technique one step further for Seven." So one day Khondji unexpectedly receives the script for Seven, and he's immediately hooked. Before he's even signed on as director of photography, he's already going over in his head how he wants the movie to look. He said, quote, "The studio, the unions, they had to accept me and everything had to be arranged. But the pictures were coming to me." And this is super cool, but at night, Khondji would walk the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan and take that as inspiration for Seven. He said, quote, "The moisture, the colors, the water, everything felt right for the movie, even though it was to be made in Los Angeles." Movies that Fincher and Khondji have cited as inspiration for the look of Seven include The French Connection, Klute, all that jazz, and Silence of the Lambs. Now, Khondji is a big fan of top lighting, and so throughout the shoot, he employed the use of fluorescence overhead, Kino flows as backlights, and then, interestingly, he employed the use of Chinese lanterns. And it's funny because Khondji thought that he had pioneered this technique of lighting with Chinese lanterns. He said, quote, "Also, for the first time, I used Chinese lanterns on a feature." He adds, "When I was a child, I had a huge paper lantern in my bedroom, which I loved. So I asked the gaffer on Delicatessen to find us some, which we used on dimmers. I thought I had invented something, until someone said to me, 'Interesting that you use the same techniques as Philippe Resolou.'" He adds, "I thought for sure the lanterns were mine." In certain scenes, such as Gluttony, Khondji would employ smoke so that the flashlights could slice through it. And then most of the film, he said, was shot very wide open, f2.5 to f2.8. And this essentially means that you get a very shallow depth of field and you make the focus puller's life a living hell. But it also gave Fincher a lot of control, being able to use the focus pulls as a way to guide the viewer's eyes. And then for the crime scenes, they were purposely designed to look kind of aesthetic. Darius Khondji said, quote, "I really saw the Kevin Spacey character as a sort of conceptual artist, making installations with each murder, and there were different references for every scene. From photographs of Joel Peter Witkin, which David suggested I look at, to certain paintings by Edward Munch, where the green claustrophobic images influence scenes like the Sloth sequence." And not only is Seven a dark movie thematically, but it is visually very dark. Throughout filming, they would regularly shoot a few stops underexposed interiors, overexposed lights, all in an attempt to achieve that contrasty look that they were going for. Darius Khondji said, quote, "Being under or over a few stops is not much normally, but when you are increasing the contrast so dramatically with a special color process, it is a lot, especially when pushing the stock a stop as well." And this actually caused a bit of backlash from New Line, who had concerns that the movie would be just too dark to look at. And so Darius Khondji suggested maybe they print the film a little bit brighter, but David Fincher was like, hell no. And in the most Fincher-like fashion, was completely uncompromising on this. And all of this would change after a showreel for Seven was put together and screened at the theater-owned convention Show West, which is where a bunch of theater operators get together and look at the upcoming material. And these theater owners freaking love the way that Seven looked. And it was after this that New Line was like, okay boys, maybe you're onto something. Now, one of the main characters of Seven is just the city itself, the city that is perpetually raining, the city with no name, the city that, as we've discussed, was heavily inspired by New York. And it's amazing to think that they shot this movie exclusively in Los Angeles. So how did they achieve this? And it largely comes down to two words: rain towers. Dreaded rain towers. Morgan Freeman said, quote, "When I read this script, I thought we were going to be someplace like Seattle or somewhere where it rained all the time. They said, oh, we're going to shoot it right here. I said, where are you going to get all this rain? Oh, don't tell me. Rain towers." And I haven't experienced this before, but apparently rain towers are grueling to shoot under, and all actors fear them. Brad Pitt described it as, quote, "It became a daily grind." And maybe one of the facts of the video, but in this movie, it was not supposed to be raining all the time. That sort of came about by accident and almost through necessity of having to keep the continuity between certain scenes while filming on a tight schedule. Fincher talks about how they shot the Sloth scene early into the schedule, and he said this, quote, "This was actually raining the day we shot this. It was pissing down rain. And this is actually one of the reasons we kept the rain, because, you know, we had 55 days to make the movie, and this was part of the location shooting where it was just pouring down. So we said, let's keep it for this scene and keep it for that scene, and I will just make it rain the whole time." Because initially it was going to be whatever the weather was on the day. We knew we wanted to have rain going into the first Gluttony murder, but it was one of those things that worked in our favor. And I've always found it really fascinating that one of the first things you think about when you think of Seven is the rain, and yet the most famous scene from this movie is the one and only scene where there is no rain. And Brad Pitt jokes about this in the commentary track. He's like, "It's funny we get to daylight out of here. You know, the first time when John Doe shows up," to which Fincher is like, "Happenstance. If I could have soaked that street, it would have been there." And with all that out of the way, let's start unpacking this beautiful timeline that we have. So Seven opens with Somerset getting together some of his belongings before arriving at the Gluttony murder. And if you noticed, amongst his stuff, there is a small piece of There is a small piece of torn off wallpaper that he puts into his pocket. And this piece of wallpaper was a part of a much more elaborate opening that explores the idea of Somerset wanting to escape the city after his retirement. And it was in the screenplay, and they actually shot and edited this opening. Brad Pitt said, quote, "There was a beautiful opening where Somerset goes to look at an old house, pulls a little piece of wallpaper off. It's his dream place where he wants to retire. It sounds completely cornball, but it was so beautifully shot." And it does exist as a deleted scene. So if you want to look it up, it's not too hard to find. And yeah, I echo everything that Brad Pitt said. And so it's like they shot this opening. Why didn't they use it? And the reason was because after this opening scene, there was going to be an opening credit sequence that was going to connect Somerset's journey from the house into the city, and it was going to be his train ride as the credits played. Fincher said, quote, "We pulled it because the title sequence was supposed to be the train ride, and we were going to have to go back east to do the train ride. But when Fincher approaches the studio to do this, they say, 'We have run out of money. Please go do something else.'" And so that's what they do, something completely different. And I think this is one of those cases where constraints breed the most interesting and most creative outcomes, because the opening titles to Seven are iconic. And I know I say that word a lot, but it is one of the most instantly recognizable moments of this movie. Brad Pitt said, quote, "I've seen that some version of these opening credits in a million different commercials, 17 different films following, and it's extremely beautiful, and at the same time, it's a bit terrifying." Fincher said, quote, "We knew we had to shoot the title sequence. We knew we had $50,000 or something to do the title sequence, and we knew we couldn't go do the Amtrak thing. We couldn't take Morgan to the East Coast and do it. He was unavailable to us anymore." And so we started thinking about what is the thing that is lacking at the beginning of this. We need to kind of know that there is a guy out there doing weird, fucked up stuff. So maybe the title sequence should be about the weird, fucked up stuff he's doing. And at this point in the production, the notebooks had already been made for the apartment scene later on. Now, in the film, they say there's like 2,000 notebooks. They didn't make that many for the movie, but they did make a lot, and these were handwritten, hand-stitched, and just full of a bunch of disturbing shit. And the gentlemen in charge of making these notebooks were Clive Piercy and John Sable. It cost $15,000, and these guys spent 2 months making these things. Now, before Piercy and Sable got involved with making the notebooks, apparently there was an original set of notebooks that Fincher was not a big fan of because he felt that they were too decorative, and he wanted something with a bit more bit more guts to it. And Fincher requested in these new notebooks that the handwriting be obsessive and that the design of them should reference work by the Starn twins and Robert Frank. And I'll pull up some images on the screen, but the influence is very direct, especially stuff by the Starn twins. It's almost one-to-one. The handwriting in the notebooks was done by Sable himself, and he has described the process as painful. And he tells his story about how he used to go down to Kinko's to get the photos printed out for John Doe's notebooks, and how the teenagers working the counter were just freaked out because he's printing out some of like the weirdest, most twisted things you can imagine. You know, these guys are like, why is this man printing out these things? And then each of the notebooks were literally hand stitched. And then to get that worn look, they were then put into an oven. And when they came out, Piercy described them as beautiful. But during the process of making these notebooks, apparently Fincher just kept pushing for more notebooks, for more detail. And towards the end of it, Clive and John were starting to get kind of fed up with it. And this next part's kind of messed up. But as Sable was going through files looking for things to put into the John Doe notebooks, he came across a real life letter. And I'm probably gonna have to bleep that word, but I think you know what I'm saying. And he put it into the notebook, and when Piercy saw it, he was like, whoa, John, this is dark. How did you come up with this? And John was like, nah, this is a real letter. But let's leave it there in the notebooks for the filmmakers to find as payback for what they've put us through. And it's pretty wild to think that all of this work and suffering that these two guys went through was originally intended for like maybe 20 seconds of screen time in the apartment scene. So I guess it's good that in the end they did get used for something more than just that. Fincher said, quote, "And we spent like $15,000 making John Doe's books, and they were really, works of art. And Kyle," he's referring to the title designer Kyle Cooper, "Kyle's like, why don't you use these? These are great. Why don't we see this stuff?" And so that's what they did. And then to get those shaky titles, they used a technique that I'm not even going to try to like explain because I don't fully understand it, but it involves using a pin registered camera in a way that it's not supposed to be used. And this results in the two elements wiggling against each other, which is normally what you don't want to happen. But David Fincher said, quote, "And I was going, why don't we want the two things wiggling against each other?" I can't say this. But David Fincher said, quote, "And I was going, why don't we want the two things wiggling against each other? I mean, in a weird way, doesn't the way that John Doe looks at the world kinda wiggly?" And this leads us into Gluttony. So Fincher has repeatedly said that one of his main inspirations for the look of Seven was the TV show Cops. I've got it right there. And in Cops, when a camera crew enters a house, it's a real house. There's not designated space for cameras and equipment. So what you end up with is very tight shots. You've got the cameraman like bumping up against the wall. So when building the sets for Seven, Fincher wanted to make sure that the rooms were sized properly in an attempt to try to capture the realism from the TV show Cops. Fincher said, quote, "I mean, we built most of the sets for the movie. One of the things that we said is it has to be like Cops. Don't give me any more room in a kitchen than what would be there. Don't overscale." And so for the Gluttony set, they build it really small. And then to get that gross and musty look, they actually just made it gross and musty. Fincher tells his story about how one of the executives from New Line came down to visit the Gluttony set for the first time. He said, quote, "Our executive at New Line came down to, kind of make sure we weren't, snorting coke in our solid gold trailers or whatever and making sure that the money was being spent." He continues, "So there's this platform built off the ground with all these like walls built around it with trash bags lining it. And they've smeared Vaseline into the corners so that the cockroaches don't disappear through the cracks in the sets. And it is truly disgusting. Also, they've splattered real tomato sauce, so it's rotten. It's been sitting there for a week waiting for us to shoot it. The set's all dressed and it smells like there's this giant dead guy there." He continues, "So she came down to the set, and here's Bob, who's been in makeup for 10 hours already, and he comes out on set from his dressing room and he looks dead. He's got contacts in and everything, and he's white, and he's got all these veins painted onto his body. And he sits in this chair, and he has a little scuba thing that he puts into his mouth, and he puts his face in a bowl of spaghetti, and he can breathe through this tube. And he's sitting there, and it's almost as dark on set as what you see." Fincher adds, "She just took like 2 looks around and went, okay, see you guys later." But honestly, it's not even that bad. I mean, that's just the setup of an average PC gamer. Am I right, boys? And this leads us into Greed, the murder of corrupt lawyer Eli Gould. And we could dip into the Se7en graphic novels. And this was one of the revelations of putting together this video, but Se7en has officially licensed graphic novels. In terms of Eli Gould, I don't think his lore is that interesting, to be honest. He's sort of just your typical bad guy lawyer. But remember these, because we'll dive into them later when explaining John Doe. What I do want to talk about though, is how the Greed murder is a reference to Shakespeare. So in the Shakespeare play, The Merchant of Venice, the moneylender Shylock demands from the businessman Antonia a pound of his flesh if his debt is not repaid. And this is what John Doe is referencing with the Greed murder. In the graphic novels, John Doe has the line, "Do you read Shakespeare?" But what he does is he holds Eli Gould at gunpoint and demands that he cuts out a pound of his flesh and place it onto the scales of justice, and then he will be set free. But of course, a byproduct of cutting out a pound of your flesh is that you bleed out. So kind of a lose-lose. But I can just picture Andrew Kevin Walker sitting there at night in New York writing Se7en, and he's like, I'll use that Shakespeare thing. But let him cook for a second, because I came up with a theory, and I told people this in my life. They were not that impressed, but I thought it was pretty cool. So I'm gonna share it. So Andrew Kevin Walker starts writing Se7en sometime around 1989, 1990, and when he's doing this, he's in New York City. Do you know what else happened in New York City in 1989 to 1990? Dustin Hoffman starred in a high-profile Shakespeare revival on Broadway, and the Shakespeare play in question, The Merchant of Venice. So I posit that around the time Andrew Kevin Walker is writing Se7en, he has Merchant of Venice on his brain because of this play. Now, maybe he went to go and see it. I'm not quite sure. I think Broadway's expensive and he was working at Tower Records, but it was probably being advertised everywhere, right? So when he's writing Se7en, the reason he uses The Merchant of Venice is because he's seeing the play advertised around New York, and it's on his mind. Now, granted, he was working at Tower Records, kind of minimum wage, so maybe he wasn't going to Broadway, and he is a writer, so he's probably also just familiar with Shakespeare. But I thought it was a weird coincidence. And something that we get a good look at in the Greed scene is Detective Mills' costume, and in particular, his ties. And I love these things. I think they're so goofy. But what's interesting is that in the original screenplay, Detective Mills was written to be pretty suave and slick, and he wore fitted Armani suits. David Fincher described him as a bit of a hipster. But the idea to then flip that on its head and make David Mills someone who's not very fashion forward was pretty much old Brad Pitt's idea. And Fincher tells his story about how one day the costume designer for Se7en, Mike Kaplan, meets with him and is like, Brad wants a specific tie for the character. And Fincher is like, okay, what is it? And Kaplan is like, I'm not sure you're gonna like it. It's a whole series. And Kaplan pulls out the ties, and one's got footballs on it, one's got basketballs on it, one's got fish on it. And Fincher immediately loves it. Fincher said, quote, and I was like, amazing, of course. You know, this guy doesn't care about ties. He's not looking for something, he's looking for something he likes. It's like, you know, a kid with their Darth Vader sheets. Brad Pitt said, quote, there's something so naive about Mills and his ideals coming in like the hot gun and thinking he's got it all figured out. There's right, there's wrong, and I'm on the right side. And those ties just kind of gave something away for me. And I love this idea about how a costume can reveal something about a character. And would you believe it? I found a website that sells 100% screen accurate Se7en movie ties. What's crazier is that I bought them. If you're a bit strange like me and you've always wanted to know what the Se7en ties look like close up, this is the basketball one. This is sort of the main tie that he wears. And this is the football tie. I believe he wears this in the bar scene with Somerset. This is the bass one. There's just like a lot of bass. Look at how detailed it is. It's so cool. And this is the big bass one. Anyways, I think they're super cool. They were not financially a viable thing to do. But I want to make the best videos I can. So I don't know, like and subscribe. I can fuel my tie addiction. And this takes us into the library scene where we get Somerset going through the Canterbury Tales, Divine Comedy, Dante's Purgatory, all while Air and the G-string plays. And it's a really beautiful scene. And Fincher talks about on the commentary how if Se7en was made today, this is one of the scenes that a studio would try to cut, because on paper, it's a 4-minute scene with no dialogue that doesn't really progress the plot in any meaningful way, but I love the way that Fincher describes it as a moment of characterization. Fincher said, quote, "I love those scenes where people kind of sort of exist in this world that you're positing. So the world isn't just there to kind of, fuel the narrative. It's also about how people exist in a place." And fun fact, the library from Seven is shot in the same building as the bank building from The Mask, which is also a film done by New Line. And Fincher jokes about how New Line likes shooting things there so much that they should have just bought the place. But these days, this location is known as the Majestic Downtown, and it's in Los Angeles, and it's pretty much just an event space now. Like, a ton of music videos and things have been shot there, and I'll pull them up on the screen. But yeah, it's mainly just events and weddings. Weddings are like the big thing that they do there. But could you imagine that? A Seven-themed wedding in the library from Seven? You could have Air and the G-String as your wedding song. You could have the pastor cosplay as John Doe. Head in the box wedding cake. I don't know much about weddings. And this leads us into the dinner scene when Tracy invites Somerset over and they have dinner together. And surprisingly, this is a really significant moment in the movie, not just because it sets up the character of Tracy, but her introduction and her meeting Somerset directly affects the relationship between Somerset and Mills going forward. Morgan Freeman describes this really eloquently. He said about Somerset, quote, "He and Mills warm more to each other because of her, and it changes his entire thought process. After this night, he's no longer chapping at the bit to abandon this project, to get out of it. He's much more willing to be available to Mills." And then we get that iconic moment when they're all sitting at the dinner table and the subway goes by and it just rattles the house. And when they were filming this, that house was shaking, and there's a really interesting story behind how they achieved this effect. So the apartment was a set that was built on a platform, and then underneath it, attached to it, were a bunch of gasoline-powered VW engines. And Fincher talked about how on the day that they shot this, the crew had a ton of fun pranking new people on set. They'd walk on a set, they'd have no idea about the gasoline-powered engines. Someone would flick a switch, the whole place starts shaking, and they'd freak out. And then after dinner, we get to Somerset and Mills sitting on the couch, going through the photographs and working on the case. And there's a couple of details here. Firstly, just how Mills is pouring Somerset's wine into just like a regular cup. It's not a fancy wine glass or anything. And it just speaks again to Mills' level of naivety and how he doesn't care about those sort of things. But also, stemless wine glasses kind of gas. So, he's kind of onto something. And originally when they shot this scene, there was a lot more dialogue that got cut from the movie. And this is what it is. It's pretty funny. Basically, Mills goes on this tangent about thumb recall. And Somerset's like, "What's that?" And Mills is like, "Thumb recall. For perpetrators of violent crimes, recall their thumbs. You'd certainly be able to spot them, and you wouldn't sell guns to them, even if they could hold them. Thumb recall." And Somerset goes, "Yeah, maybe thumb recall." Fincher said about this, quote, "It's this scene that Andy and I cooked up, and it was the first thing cut by New Line. They're like, you got to get rid of that thumb recall scene. Somebody's going to take that idea and run with it, and we're going to get sued." And outside of this small bit of dialogue that was cut from the movie, I'm not sure if it comes through super strong, but Pitt and Fincher both talk about in the commentary track how they pictured Mills as someone with a level of closeted fascism. He's a more conservative guy. He doesn't think about politics that much, but there is that underlying conservative upbringing that informs his worldview. Brad Pitt said that he thought that Mills had a, quote, "religious right upbringing. Let's say George W. Bush thing." And then the last detail from this scene is just goated Morgan Freeman things. So if you see Somerset, he's arranging the photographs and it looks like he's doing something really specific, like proper detective work. And apparently they shot this angle for like half a day. And the whole time Fincher's over by the video monitor and he's like, "Whatever Morgan's doing there looks really good. Okay, time to shoot the over the shoulder then." So they go to shoot the over the shoulder and Fincher describes the rest of it like this, quote, "And Morgan goes, 'Well, what do you want me to do?' And I go, 'Well, what you been doing?' And he goes, 'Oh, I've just been rearranging these photographs. I haven't been doing anything. I've just been looking here and looking there and doing this. Which ones do you want me to pick up?' And I was so convinced that he'd worked out this whole thing because it looked so good. It looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. And the whole time he was just winging it. So now every time I watch this scene back, I just find it really funny watching Morgan Freeman because it looks like he's just such a good actor. It looks like he knows what he's doing. In reality, he has no idea. And then following this, we get the sequence where Somerset and Mills go and interview Eli Gould's wife. They end up finding those fingerprints that they think could be John Doe's, and they take him back to the station and run him through the database. And they end up falling asleep on the couch together at the station, and it's one of those iconic images from this movie. And this takes us into the sloth scene. And I can still remember the first time I ever watched this. I think I was around about 12 years old. I was sick, home from school, and I had a stack of weeklies that we had hired out. I just remember getting chills watching this. The descending brass, the build up with the cop cars going in, the SWAT team, the rain, and you have no idea what's going to happen. It, for me, is one of the canonical movie watching moments of my life. It's funny because if I think back on that memory, it feels huge. You know, I'm like, this is cinema. But yet I'm watching it on this tiny little box. And that's the power of cinema, baby. So heading the SWAT team, we have John C. McGinley giving maybe the heat check performance of the film. But then all of the SWAT team around him, legit SWAT team. These guys were trained SWATs. That's not how you would say that. And now it's time to bust one of the most famous urban legends of Se7en. One of those IMDb movie trivia facts that everyone knows about. I'm gonna bust it. So when McGinley's character goes to check on the sloth victim, he thinks it's a corpse. So he gets up close and personal, and then boom, one of the top 5 jump scares ever. McGinley's character flies back, and there's that line, he's like, "It's alive, it's alive." And the urban legend is that McGinley's reaction is 100% real because the actor himself thought that that was a prosthetic corpse. He did not know that that was an actor. But Fincher had this to say about it. And whenever he refers to Michael, he's talking about the actor who played the sloth victim. So Fincher said, quote, "The makeup effects endured by our wonderful sloth took, I'm gonna say 6 or 7 hours. I mean, his call, Michael's call, was midnight in order to have him on set. The makeup was applied and then he had to be transported. Because they were gelatin, he had to be transported in a kind of semi-refrigerated, not an ambulance, but a van." Fincher continues, "So he was literally like medevaced up the stairs into the giant penny building and placed and art directed into that. So the idea that we could keep that a secret is in and of itself like, that would have been an entire act for the game in order for that." Fincher continues, "McGinley likes a big response. So if you need somebody to jump out of their skin, get John because he can do it. And by the way, we shot 19 takes of it, so." And so that is myth busted on the McGinley reaction being real. But just a quick vent, on the Wikipedia page for Se7en, it says that McGinley's reaction was genuine and it was the first take. So then I looked at what it was citing, and it was this Yahoo article from 2015 with the sloth actor Michael Reed McKay. And in that article it says McGinley's reaction was the first take. But then we have Fincher's quote where he says they shot 19 takes. Of course it's not the first reaction. So I guess what I'm saying is like, can we get some Wikipedia editors up in here? And for the sloth scene, they shot this on location in this dingy apartment building. And cinematographer Darius Kanji has an interesting story about how they shot it and achieved the look. Kanji said, quote, "I remember we shot that scene in this really inspiring downtown location that was the real deal. There were condoms and crack vials all over the floor, which we had to clean up. But then we put in our own crack vials and hung green fragrance trees all around. And we lit the location very brutally with green gelled HMIs planted on the building across the street so that the light could come through the windows." What a quote. And this takes us into that really brief scene in the stairwell where Mills and Somerset bump into that photojournalist, aka John Doe, who takes Mills' photograph, and Mills just cracks it at him. And what you realize when you rewatch this scene is that this is the moment when it's all over for Mills. This is the moment his life essentially ends, because Doe knows that he wants someone to become Wrath, but he doesn't know who that's going to be yet. And so what he's doing here is he's testing out the detectives to see how they're going to respond. And when he elicits this violent response from Mills, that's the moment it's all over for Mills, because now John Doe knows this is the guy. He will become Wrath when I need him to be. And Somerset calls it out right then and there. He has the line, quote, "It's impressive to see a man feeding off of his emotions." And then about 1 hour into the movie, we get the diner scene between Tracy and Somerset where she confides in him that she's pregnant. And I think it's worth pointing out just how well acted this scene is in particular. It's essentially just over-the-shoulder coverage of two people talking. It's completely captivating. Like the way that Freeman tells the story of giving up the child that he never had, there's so much space in his delivery and his performance. And then with the small amount of dialogue that Gwyneth has to work with, she's just tearing up the screen. Like the stuff that she does with her face is insane. It's a masterclass. If you haven't rewatched this in a while, just go back and watch how well acted this scene is. It's so good. And I'll debunk another internet mystery. Yeah, that's what I'll call it. I'm gonna bust it. But for years, people speculated that at the start of the diner scene, John Doe walks into the diner and is spying on Tracy and Somerset. And it's because if you go and watch back the scene, there is a gentleman who looks very much like John Doe. But with the release of the recent 4K of Se7en, you can clearly see that this gentleman is not John Doe. To be fair, he does look a lot like John Doe though. And knowing how obsessive David Fincher is for detail, I do wonder how deliberate this is. Also, I might talk about this a bit more at the end, but this thing looks so good. Like the scan itself, that is. Hot take though, I don't know if steel cases are my preference. I think mine's already scratched. And it's just been sitting on my desk. So, I don't know. Are you meant to like vacuum seal these? I don't know. And then we cut to the police station with Somerset and Mills, and Mills in this scene drops the line of the movie. And of course, that's when he spits the bar. Just because the fucker's got a library card doesn't make him Yoda. And it's amusing to look back on it and realize that it is literally this line of dialogue that sets Somerset and Mills on the correct path to catch John Doe. The man's a freaking genius. So we have this line of dialogue that leads us into that scene with the shady FBI guy. Somerset and Mills pull up John Doe's Goodreads profile, and before you know it, they're knocking on John Doe's apartment. And this leads us into the chase scene. And when people think of greatest chase sequences of all time, you know, your mind goes to Mad Max, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Maybe you got like Jason Bourne in there. But I would make the case that in the middle of this psychological thriller, there is a chase sequence that at least deserves to be in the conversation. Like, it's not as flashy and it's not as expensive, but man, is it effective. So when David Fincher was approaching how to film and choreograph the chase sequence, he thought to himself, what is the one thing that I dislike most about chase scenes in movies? And what he landed on is that in most movies, it seems like the good guy always knows where the bad guy is. And then because of this, the chases lack this sense of danger. The good guy always springs around the corner with confidence with his gun as if nothing bad's gonna happen. And so for the chase scene in Se7en, Fincher took the chase scene playbook and he threw it out the window. Fincher said, quote, "If every corner can hold somebody with a 9mm, it's like you don't come around them with confidence." And I really love that about this scene. It puts you right into the shoes of Brad Pitt's character. You feel just as disorientated as he is, and every corner he walks around, there is that sense of danger, that element of danger that Fincher was talking about lacking from other movies. And like very sneakily, something that I think really heightens the sense of danger in the chase scene happens earlier in the movie in the car ride on the way to the Sloth murder, when Somerset and Mills are in the car talking about if they've ever pulled their guns out on duty before. And Somerset says something along the lines of, "I've only ever pulled my gun out 3 times in 34 years and never pulled the trigger." And so when the guns do come out in the chase scene, you know it's not everyday routine like other cop movies. When they pull out their guns, it's meaningful and there is gravity to the situation. And I just find it so fascinating how a simple line of dialogue that's almost throwaway can raise the stakes and elevate an entire set piece more than any number of explosions or expensive CGI could ever do. That is the power of good storytelling. And this scene is just so beautifully shot. This shot of Mills coming down the ladder is in the movie for like half a second. Why does it look so good? And I just want to claim that I think this scene is how you do shaky cam. It is the optimum Goldilocks zone of shakiness. It gives the scene that propulsive effect that you want shaky cam to do, but you can still see what's going on. I just think I'm still traumatized from Mission Impossible 3. I enjoy that movie, but like JJ, why are you gonna shake the camera so much? And Darius Kanji has said that this chase sequence was the most difficult scene to film. And they had to actually reshoot part of the scene because Morgan Freeman was underexposed. That's just how dark it was in those hallways. And another piece from the chase scene is that Brad Pitt insisted on doing some of his own stunts. And this gets us into one of the most infamous parts of lore from the Se7en production, which is that Brad Pitt broke his arm during the filming of this sequence. And so when Mills shows up in the movie wearing a cast in the next scene, that is a real cast because Brad Pitt actually injured himself. And so they had to write it into the story. And I'd heard about this before, but until doing research for the video, I didn't realize how gnarly the injury actually is. You usually see it reported as Brad Pitt broke his arm during the filming of the chase scene. It's a little bit worse than that. Now, the shot where Pitt injures himself doesn't make the final cut of the movie. I wish you could see this. There's a weenie dog at my feet. I don't know how I'm gonna move. Are you comfortable there? Oh, she left. Come back. Now, the shot where Brad Pitt broke his arm didn't make the final cut of the movie, but it happened when he was doing parkour across those cars in the rain on the way to the alleyway. And I think the best way to describe how he injured himself is just to give you Brad Pitt's recount of the events. I mean, heads up if you're like a little bit squirmish. Yeah. Pitt said, quote, "I wanted to make it a little tougher. I wanted to run across the cars, get that Joe Mannix thing out of me. And we were losing the light. We only had 3 takes and we didn't get the shot because it was across the street. But on the 3rd car, I jumped from one to the next on the back window and slide down the back window like into first base, which throws me off the car and I'd hit the pavement every time. But the last one was rush, rush, rush. And I didn't set myself and I went up high and came right down through the window and I went in ass first. But I had on a wetsuit through this, so that protected me from getting cut. But it was just like I was just sitting there with my shoulders and my legs out and I did a quick body check and I was all right and I thought they were rolling. And this is how sick actors are. My first thought was, oh good, I hope they got that. So I continue the shot, and as I'm pushing myself out of this tub that I created through the glass, I put one hand on the edge and I got up and I started chasing John Doe down the street. And it wasn't until I got around the corner that I knew, oops, something went wrong. And I ended up cutting a tendon, a nerve through 3 fingers, and I walked back, and that's the only time I've seen Fincher go green. It was not pretty. Then Fincher said, quote, "He opened his hands and you could see the white of his bones, this just kind of tuft of like flesh just kind of poking out." I was just like, oh man. And writing the cast into the story is like super smart, and you're like, oh, easy workaround. Except for the fact that movies are almost never shot in chronological order. And Se7en is no exception to this. And when Brad Pitt had this injury, it was about halfway through the schedule, which meant that there was still 7 weeks of filming left. But now he has a broken arm. And what this means is that there are scenes earlier in the movie where Brad Pitt has his cast on, but it hasn't happened in the story yet, so they have to hide it. And I've seen this movie so many times, and I had never noticed it before. But once I point it out, you will not be able to unsee. The first one is the infamous plaid jacket. So earlier in the production, Pitt and Fincher wanted Mills to be a guy that wore a lot of plaid. He's just really into plaid. He's a big plaid guy. And so they had this whole wardrobe made of plaid. But then at some point they decided maybe we won't do the plaid thing. But then Brad Pitt injures himself and they're like, oh crap, how are we gonna hide the cast in these earlier scenes? Let's whip out that plaid jacket. And so when Mills is wearing the plaid jacket, Brad Pitt has his cast on underneath it. And the most obvious moment is when Tracy calls a police station to invite Somerset over for dinner. And if you look at Brad Pitt's arm, you will notice it's kind of thick. His hand is swollen and the color of it does not match the rest of him. Fincher said, quote, "And when we were timing the movie, we kept getting thrown off by the color of his left hand because the cast is cinched and taped around his wrist." He adds, "And it's just cinched around there, so his hand is purple throughout this whole scene." And I kept looking at it going, God, we got to get the purple out of it. Add some more green to it. And this leads us into John Doe's apartment. And we have that great moment when Somerset and Mills are outside of the door arguing whether or not they should go in. And Somerset's like, we can't go in. We need a warrant. We have no reason to be here. And Mills is like, okay, you're right. I'm all fucked up. And then he just kicks in the door. We have that amazing shot where the dolly pulls back and Mills is in the doorway. And Mills is like, well, no point in arguing anymore. Unless you can fix that. Extremely random fact, but at the end of the original 1997 trailer for the first Men in Black movie, there is a shot where Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith walk through a door and strike a pose. And then it's revealed that the door is the I in the MIB logo. But David Fincher confirmed that this image was directly inspired by the shot of Mills kicking in John Doe's door. And I think this just speaks to the influence of Se7en, even on just like tiny little things. What's the butterfly effect if Se7en never gets made? What does the end of the Men in Black trailer look like? Do they crawl through the bee? And then we have that little in-between scene where Mills and Somerset bribe the homeless lady to give them an alibi for breaking into John Doe's apartment. And I love this moment. You have the good guys doing morally ambiguous things. And I think this is a moment that a lot of movies wouldn't even be bothered with including. And you can say Seven is a genre movie. It's pulp, which it is all of these things, but it is little moments like these and details that show you like the richness of the text. And it's what separates it from a lot of other movies in its class. It's why it stands apart. And then we enter John Doe's apartment, or John Doe's lair, which is how Andrew Kevin Walker likes to describe it. It is very lair-like. And there's a lot of cool details here. Like there's a drawer full of empty aspirin bottles, which is then later referenced in the John Doe notebooks when he describes how he gets chronic headaches. We see the spaghetti sauce from the Gluttony murder. We have clippings of Eli Gould. There's the Sloth victim's hand and the invoice for Wild Bill's leather shop for the order of the knife suit. I don't even quite know what to call that contraption. The insert shots of that thing in this movie are genuinely some of the most terrifying things in it. But great to see that it's being invoiced as one custom leather for, how much money was it? $502.62 in 1995. You know what that money could have bought you in 1995? PlayStation 1, a couple of games, Mortal Kombat, Lemmings. Imagine if John Doe had lemmings. That would have chilled him right out. Another detail is that in John Doe's apartment, and this comes from Andrew Kevin Walker, but he said that there is a pommel horse somewhere. But that means that it is confirmed canon that John Doe works out. I don't know what the John Doe split is. I imagine there's calisthenics involved. Pre-workout aspirin, most likely. Another little tidbit is that when John Doe calls the apartment and Mills answers the phone, when they were shooting that, it was actually David Fincher on the other end of the phone reading the lines, and they dubbed Spacey's voice in later. And then we have the moment when Somerset reads John Doe's diaries, and I think we should all appreciate that if we have to have John Doe's diaries read to us, at least we get them read to us in the soothing dulcet tones of Morgan Freeman. Oh, you're so cute. It's actually kind of amazing that we get that. So this leads us into the Lust murder. And this will be a good opportunity to talk about the psychology of John Doe. And we can dive into the 7 graphic novels, which go a long way in detailing it. So from September of 2006 through to October 2007, Zenescope Entertainment published a series of 7 graphic novels based upon Seven. And these were officially licensed by New Line Cinema. And each issue takes one of the sins and it dives into the backstory of the victim, John Doe's perspective, and it weaves in entries from John Doe's diary with flashbacks from John Doe's childhood. And the approach here is really interesting because each of the issues is done in a different art style by different artists. I think some of the novels are more successful than others at this, but I do really like what they were going for, which is to explore John Doe through a fractured mosaic of different art styles, sort of emblematic of his psyche and the character himself. And in the graphic novels, we learn that prior to the events of the movie, as an adult, John Doe led a relatively normal life. He had a wife, he worked a white-collar job at an insurance company. However, we see this sort of fall apart because Doe is fired from the insurance company for being too empathetic towards the families filing claims, and then his wife also leaves him because of a lack of intimacy. In the graphic novels, we see John Doe's wife telling him, "You don't touch me anymore." And then John Doe responds to that with, "For you can no longer bear children," which is crazy. And it leads me into my next point. So on the commentary track for Seven, Richard Dyer talks about how when we look at real life examples of serial killers, oftentimes they're motivated by a perversion. They target women, and the crimes are misogynistic in nature. And Dyer talks about how in the case of John Doe, he doesn't seem to be motivated in the same way, and that what he is doing is more ideologically based. But I think there's a case to be made that John Doe shares some of these same tendencies, and despite him describing himself as ideologically motivated, his crimes are a lot more personal than he lets on. Just consider how John Doe punishes women. In the case of lust, the man is the one who is committing the sin of lust for seeking out the sex worker. It's not the sex worker herself who is feeling lustful. And yet John Doe kills her in a horrific way, and he feels justified in doing this based upon his ideology. But why? And that is because Doe views her simply as a vessel for the man's sin. He sees her only in as far as she is an extension of a man. And in John Doe's worldview, that is enough to condemn her. And we can infer from this that John Doe views women as Eve-like figures, representations of temptation, and that within and of itself is a misogynistic idea. And then we have Tracy Mills, who doesn't commit any sin in this movie. And in the bleak world of Seven, is probably the most morally upstanding character that we have, and yet John Doe kills her. So if he is truly ideologically motivated by these 7 deadly sins, how does he justify this? Well, this is because he doesn't view Tracy as a person. He kills her for 2 reasons. 1, because it's convenient for his plan, and 2, because John Doe envies Mills' life. He envies the love that he has for his wife. And so Tracy is simply another vessel for John Doe's own sin of envy. All of this to say, John Doe views women purely as moral reflections of men and not as individuals. And it's a bit convoluted, but I think it makes the case that John Doe, like many real-world examples of serial killers, shares the same misogynistic tendencies. And I think this is an idea that the graphic novels goes out of its way to explore. And a lot of time is spent in the graphic novels in John Doe's childhood. We see that he grew up without a father figure, his mother was highly abusive, and the environment that he grew up in was hyper religious. And based upon some of the events in the graphic novels, and then just extrapolating from the movie itself, I think it's safe to say that John Doe's crimes are not as ideologically based as he would want you to believe, and a lot of it comes from a place of deeply internalized shame from his childhood. And yeah, if you're into Seven, you could check out these graphic novels. They're rare and very expensive, but there's a place, you can find them online pretty easy for free. Full warning, they are very dark. They go to places that like the movie wouldn't even try to go to. I think it's a one and done for me. I don't think it's like a reread. And there's some cool moments in them. This panel here is one of the most terrifying things ever. And then this panel here is super cool because this is actually a frame from the storyboard that Fincher talked about wanting to shoot and get into the movie, but they never got the opportunity to do it. So it's really cool that they rendered it out in the graphic novels. And I'm not a huge fan of retcon, but as far as retcon goes, I think these novels are really well considered. Anyways, back to the movie, and this gets us into the interrogation scene. And we need to talk about Leland Orser and what he's doing here, because it doesn't even really feel like acting. It comes across as genuine trauma. And the way that Orser achieved this effect is that before every take, he would make himself hyperventilate. Fincher said, quote, "I tell ya, the day we shot that, he was hyperventilating. To get himself to that point, he would sit in the corner and hyperventilate. So between takes, you would look over and see this guy going, and then he would be ready and we would start shooting again. And he was literally trembling because he was oxygen starved." It was a good trick. The next scene is the bar scene between Somerset and Mills, where they elaborate on their philosophies, they discuss apathy, and I think this is just a nice character moment. It ramps down the tension before maybe one of the most tense final half an hours to a movie ever, and it's nice because it thematically ties a lot of the ideas of the movie together. But the sad thing is that whenever they ran this movie on TV for years and years and years, this scene would usually get cut out just to, save time, which I just think is so unfortunate. And this leads into the Pride murder. And one thing that stands out about this movie after multiple rewatches is just the pacing of it. The first 2/3 are so methodical. You're in the process, you're finding clues, you're piecing together the puzzle. And then by the time we get here, we breeze through the lust scene, and the Pride scene, the total runtime is 43 seconds. So you're coming out of the Pride scene, still sort of processing what's happening, and there is so much momentum. When John Doe waltzes into that precinct covered in blood, you were caught so off guard. And it's like, you are on the roller coaster now. There is no getting off. A nice detail in the Pride scene is that the coroner has the line, quote, "He cut off her nose, and he did it very recently." So then when John Doe walks into that precinct covered in blood, we as the audience sort of assume, oh, that must be the blood of the Pride victim. And it's a subtle thing, but it really wrong-foots us and sets up for the reveal at the end of the movie. Because of course, that's the blood of Gwyneth Paltrow's character. That's Tracy's blood. And it makes it so much more unnerving watching it on a rewatch when Mills is telling Doe to get on the ground and Doe is smiling at him and he's covered in the blood of his wife. God, this movie, man. And I'm not sure if this is a subconscious thing that the filmmakers are doing, but Tracy is mentioned an increasing number of times in the build-up at the end. The first time is when Mills and Somerset enter the precinct, and the receptionist tells Mills, "Your wife called. Get an answering machine." Then when negotiating with John Doe's lawyer, Mills has the line, quote, We've got him downstairs, locked up, done deal. He's gonna get his free room and board. He's gonna get his free cable TV. Hell, my wife doesn't even have cable. And then lastly, when Mills and Somerset are shaving their chests, Mills says, quote, "If I keep coming home late, my wife's going to think something's up." And I assume that this is a deliberate choice by the filmmakers to do something to our subconscious. I hadn't noticed it until, the last few rewatches. So, well played, boys. Well fucking played. Also, in that same scene, we get one of my favorite lines of the movie, which is when Somerset says, quote, "If John Doe's head splits open and a UFO should fly out, I want you to have expected it." The writing in this film is so good, man. And Morgan Freeman's delivery of that line in particular. And this takes us into maybe the most rewatchable scene of the movie, the car ride. Now, for the helicopter in this ending sequence, when they first test screen 7, they hadn't shot this part yet because the studio didn't think it would be necessary to go over budget to get the helicopter. But Fincher really wanted it. And so one of the things that Fincher did was in the shots where he wanted there to be a helicopter, he put these black cards that said missing helicopter shot. And so if you were an audience member seeing one of the early test screenings for 7, it's like you're locked in for an hour and a half into this movie, and then you get this end sequence, and every 5 seconds, missing helicopter shot. And it worked. I mean, it must be a pretty effective strategy. I should start employing it in my YouTube videos to really test its efficacy. And I think the helicopter really heightens the end sequence. It does sort of, once again, wrong foot you because you're thinking, geez, what's John Doe gonna do? They've brought a helicopter out here. And it does make that reveal even more shocking. And for the car ride, they didn't shoot it on a soundstage or in front of a green screen. The guys were all packed into this sedan, which, is something that I really like. I do think you can tell the difference when they shoot on a soundstage versus in a real moving vehicle. However, Fincher said that if he did this again, he would not shoot it like this. Apparently it was a pain in the ass. It caused a ton of audio issues. And I mean, if you watch The Killer, I think every time Michael Fassbender is in that van, there is a giant LED panel behind him. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it does look pretty good. I mean, who am I to argue with David Fincher? He is the GOAT. And I really wanna talk about how Fincher blocks the car ride scene out because it is dripping with subtext. It's so good. So throughout the car ride, Somerset is always framed from his side of the car and there's never anything obscuring his face. So we could read this as Somerset being removed from John Doe's plan and free from the consequences of it. Now, if we look at John Doe, for the majority of the car ride, he is framed with his face obscured by the cage. In other words, he is framed behind bars, which is where he is on path to head up. He's been caught by the police and absolutely nothing crazy is going to happen at the end of this movie. Where it gets really sick though is how Fincher decides to frame Mills. At the start of the car ride, Mills is framed the same way that Somerset is, from his side of the car. But as Doe starts to elaborate on his plan and he sucks Mills in, Fincher starts cutting to this shot where Mills is now framed behind the bars because he is now part of John Doe's plan. And even though Mills doesn't know it yet, he is just as trapped as John Doe is. And this also directly foreshadows the ending of the movie because the very last shot we see of Mills is him sitting in the back of a police cruiser behind those very same bars. We cut to one of my favorite shots from a movie just ever. If you catch me staring off in the distance sometimes, there's a good chance I'm thinking about this shot. And the reason that they chose to set the final scene under the tension towers wasn't just aesthetic, it was motivated by story. Fincher imagined that John Doe had planned this out so well that he anticipated that there would be a helicopter. And so he chose this location because he knew that the tension towers would interfere with the radio frequency, and therefore Mills and Somerset could not communicate with the helicopter. Well, Fincher goes on to say, quote, "So we go out there to shoot this, and of course, it's true. You can't cue the helicopters from the ground with the walkie-talkies. So we would have to cue the actors by cellular phone." I also just love that this is the most 90s quote of all time. Cellular phone. And I know it's been memed to death. What's in the box? But I'm so astonished by Brad Pitt's performance in this scene. I still am. I don't think he gets enough credit for it because I don't really think there's a taller task you can ask of an actor than to play this scene. And then you got to consider that the entire emotional arc of the movie rests on this part of the performance. And there is such a fine line between overacting and underacting this, and Pitt absolutely kills it. He kills it. I mean, imagine you're an actor and you play this scene. How do you go home after work? You just gonna be like normal? It's like, how was your day? It's like, yeah, it was good. my wife's head was in a box. Morgan Freeman described what Brad Pitt does in the scene as, quote, such a heavy, heavy, heavy emotional place to try and reach. And to reach this emotional place, Pitt took cues from Sean Penn's performance in the 1986 film At Close Range. And if you've been watching this channel at all for any amount of time, you might know that Sean Penn, for whatever reason, just keeps organically coming up in the research that I'm doing. I swear, I'm going to be doing the Interstellar video and Sean Penn will get mentioned. I don't know how it's going to happen, but just remember I said this. Pitt said, quote, I just kept thinking of the one scene Sean Penn did in At Close Range. At the end, I kept referencing that one scene at the end. He adds, quote, there's just a few seconds, there was this complete change in him. There was something that Penn did there that you knew from that moment on what he experienced, life would never be the same again. He would never be the same. And that's what I kept trying to crack in this scene, trying to grasp what's going on, not being able to grasp it, trying to gain control of the situation, trying to reverse time. And then the trickiest part of Morgan Freeman's performance was just trying to capture his reaction to opening the box, because they weren't really sure how someone would react to that, to seeing the head of someone that they knew in a box. Fincher said, quote, we tried this ending a lot of different ways with Morgan. We actually tried a couple of different versions of his finding the head in the box. And we went back to the first one because his instincts, I think, were exactly right. That it should just be so shocked he doesn't know what to do or say. And one of the famous details from this scene is in the moment that Mills decides that he's going to shoot John Doe, Tracy's face appears on screen for a few frames, which is representative of what Mills is seeing in that moment. And if you freeze frame this shot, it's a really beautiful shot of Gwyneth Paltrow. It looks very ethereal, almost heavenly. I mean, given the themes of the movie, I think if you wanted to make the case, you could try to read this shot as Tracy looking down from heaven, which is really upsetting. And even though we don't see Tracy's head in the box, which is absolutely the right call, they did make a casting of Gwyneth Paltrow's head. But many years later, it did appear on screen in Steven Soderbergh's 2011 film Contagion. Another little tidbit is that the delivery driver at the end of the movie is played by Richmond Arquette, who is siblings with all of the other famous Arquettes, and he plays the doctor in Fight Club. Because I was like, I know this guy somewhere. That's from where? Fight Club. And then Se7en wraps up with what Fincher likes to call the Coda. We see Mills in the back of the police cruiser. Somerset has that line, I'll be around. So he's no longer retiring. He's still in the city. And then it ends with Morgan Freeman reading the Ernest Hemingway quote, the world is a fine place and worth fighting for. I agree with the second part. But initially, this coda didn't exist. What Fincher had originally intended for the ending was that the very moment Mills' gun goes off and he kills Doe, the movie cuts to black. The audience sits in silence for a few seconds, and then boom, credits roll. Cruel. And this idea made it so far that they did screen a version of this cut to black ending. Fincher recounts this story of when they screened this preview in New York, and he said, quote, the preview screening had the original ending with the gunshot, and then it went to black. And I told the guys from NRG, I said, let the audience sit in the dark for a second, and then bring the lights up slowly, give it like 10 seconds, and let them know the movie's over. Gunshot. Lights immediately come on, and they're passing out these cards. What's your favorite characters? And I'm standing in the back of the theater, I think with Bob Shay, and these three women come by, and one of them says to the other one, the people who made that movie should be killed. And I personally, I've always liked the coda. I don't have any issue with it. I even like Morgan Freeman's quote at the end, Maybe I've been Pavloved into Morgan Freeman voiceover, but, I think you need a couple of minutes to come down emotionally from the box scene. And I get that Fincher's point is to not give you that, but I need that. Now, we discussed earlier, way earlier in the video, how hard Fincher and the cast fought to keep the head in the box ending. And even after they had locked that in, there were still discussions and opinions surrounding how the sequence itself should play out. Now, New Line was of the opinion that John Doe should not win. He shouldn't get that satisfaction. Fincher said that it was a, quote, compelling argument, but I think you're splitting hairs at that point. One of these versions that was discussed was an ending in which, after finding out about what happened, Mills turns the gun on himself, which I dare say is even darker than what we end up with, to be honest. So surely New Line wasn't pushing for that one. But it was during these discussions that the coolest alternate ending was born. The Somerset sacrifice ending. And this made it into the storyboard phase. And it went something like this. Oh. David, I can't let you do this. You won't say anything. He tried to run, I shot him, whatever. David, if you're gone, who fights then? For what? Don't listen to him. David, who takes my place? What are you doing? I'm retiring. I'm not going to win any Oscars for that, but the "I'm retiring" line from Somerset has no right. Now, this version of the ending where Somerset sacrifices himself was considered, and a person who was pretty hot on it was Morgan Freeman. I think he wanted to spit that line. I think he wanted to say it. Can you imagine if Morgan Freeman said that? I'm retiring. That was not a good Morgan Freeman. Freeman said, quote, "I first understood the ending to be, and it makes sense to me, that the sacrifice was going to be Somerset's, that this young policeman was salvageable, that Somerset would do this execution, but Brad argued successfully that there was no way that he wouldn't follow through, that he would not do this. And ultimately, it made sense to everybody." And in the end, Fincher summed it up like this, quote, "Everybody kind of loses. And so that's the thing Andrew had constructed. And he'd constructed it so well, you know, that whether Morgan got him or whether Mills had turned the gun on himself or whatever, what was going to happen at the end, it was just never going to tie itself up in a neat bow. So in the end, I have to agree with the most direct, dramatic wave is what's coming from Mills. He's lost too much, he's got nothing left to lose. And even though it's not as clever, I think it's dramatically satisfying and works hand in glove with the notion of what it was supposed to be from the beginning, which is you step in evil and you have evil on you." Now, it would be super remiss if I don't at least touch upon the music. So the score for Seven was composed by Howard Shore, and he is just one of the great modern film composers. He has so many classics under his belt. And in the early 2000s, he would do the score for Lord of the Rings. So he's the man. But at this point in the 90s, Shore was probably best known for his collaborations with the legendary David Cronenberg. And one of my favorite movie scores of all time is a Shore-Cronenberg collaboration, and that is the score for the movie Crash. I really love that score. But the reason that Fincher wanted Shore to compose the music for Seven was because of another movie that he had done previously. And this movie was Silence of the Lambs. To do both Silence of the Lambs and Seven, you could basically ask any person what their favorite serial killer movie is, and no matter how they answer, he could be like, I did the music for that. Unless they answer Manhunter, which is valid. And to record the score for Seven, the orchestra that they used had over 100 people in it. It features piano, percussion, and it heavily relies on brass. And I'm convinced now, after watching this movie so many times, that brass is underutilized. At least in like more modern movies, brass is fire. So Seven gets a wide release on September 22, 1995. It opens at #1 in the box office and is surprisingly a huge hit. And at the time of its release, Seven set the record for the highest grossing opening September weekend of all time. Now, the critical response is overall pretty positive. Of course, there were certain detractors at the time, but you've got to give it to our boy Roger Ebert. He had his finger on the pulse for this one. And this takes us into the Oscars. So that year, Seven did receive one Oscar nomination, and it was for Best Film Editing. However, it did not win. Because as far as the Oscars are concerned, this was the year of Braveheart. Braveheart that year got 10 nominations and it won 5 Oscars. Just steamrolled a bunch of categories. And I think this year is emblematic of an aspect of the Oscars that is often talked about, which is that they fail to recognize in the moment, oftentimes, what the truly defining movies are. You know, the movies that will go on to be rewatched and discussed for decades afterwards. So if we're going to retcon this, I would have liked to have seen a Best Director nomination for Fincher. I mean, he's absolutely worthy for what he does in this movie. I would also like to have seen maybe a Morgan Freeman nomination. He is sensational in Seven. I kind of get this one a bit more because those categories are a bit more competitive, but I'd like to see it. And I think you could definitely make the case for Andrew Kevin Walker in Best Original Screenplay. 100%. But the one that is really curious to me is that Seven does not get nominated for Best Cinematography. It's like Darius Kanji cooked a delicious feast for the eyeballs. With no discernible expiry date, we're just going to ignore it? Now, I could understand if the Best Cinematography category was more stacked, but there was room this year. And when I first saw this, I just couldn't believe it. Because do you know what else was nominated that year in Best Cinematography instead of Seven? Batman Forever. And then like the thing that people would normally say is that Seven didn't get nominated because, you know, the Oscars don't generally recognize genre movies. You know, they prefer a more prestigious class of film, especially in the 90s. But then they nominated Batman. And I'm not here to hate on Batman Forever. I grew up with that movie, but like, Seven. I just don't understand this. Another thing that's really interesting is that in the same year that Seven comes out, both Brad Pitt and Kevin Spacey are nominated for Oscars. It's just not for Seven. So Brad Pitt was nominated in Best Supporting Actor for 12 Monkeys, and Kevin Spacey in the same category for The Usual Suspects. And Spacey actually won this year. He won Best Supporting Actor for The Usual Suspects. Is this not the end of Seven? Is this like not coincidentally super metatextual? Brad Pitt and Kevin Spacey facing off against each other, and then in the end, Spacey wins? I don't know, I just thought that was really curious. And I have to mention this because you just can't make this one up. But in 2002, New Line Cinema proposed a sequel to Seven, and it would be titled 8. This sequel, 8, would have focused on a psychic serial killer who was pursued by Somerset. But during the process of trying to catch this serial killer, Somerset himself is granted psychic abilities. Fincher said about this sequel, quote, "I would be less interested in that than I would in having cigarettes put out in my eyes." I fucking love Fincher's quotes. I don't know how I'm ever gonna top the stuff that he says in another video. Nolan, you're up. Start saying some crazy shit. But really, the Oscars aren't indicative of that much, and Seven has gone on to become one of the canonical movies of cinema. And I get this sense in the last few years that in terms of Fincher's filmography, Seven has really grown in estimation. I think for the longest time, people have looked at Fight Club as the definitive David Fincher movie. And I think, I mean, largely that is still the case. But I don't know, Seven's getting up there. It's at the point now where I feel like Seven is held almost in higher regard than Fight Club. And I think that just speaks to the fact that this movie is aging so incredibly well. It's aging like a fine wine poured into a glass cup. At the end of the commentary track, Brad Pitt says this about Seven. "It's every bit as good for me then and now. I watch it again and there's nothing that seems trendy to me or old about it or that I've moved on or grown away from. To me, this is the closest I've been to a perfect film." To which Fincher responds with, quote, "What about Fight Club?" And with that is Seven Lore Explained, but I overthought it. This video has been such an undertaking. I don't know if it comes across like in the final product, but so many hours of work went into making this. That being said, I'm a huge nerd. I love deep diving into things, and I think the plan for the channel is to just keep doing these videos. I would love to turn But I Overthought It into a series. But do let me know if this is something that you want to see more of. And if you're still watching this part of the video, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And now I'm gonna go wrap some birthday presents and I'm gonna eat some food. I'm pretty hungry.